as Ella Brooks strolled down the busy downtown avenue. The world around her was in constant motion. Honking cars, people laughing and talking, and the pleasant aroma of freshly brewed coffee wafting through the air. She was simply enjoying her walk, deep in thought, when suddenly a uniformed figure blocked her path. The officer's sharp gaze scanned her from top to bottom, a look of distrust evident on his face. Without explanation or reason, he made a demand. "Show me your ID," he said in a forceful tone, his voice dripping with authority. Ella paused, a slight frown forming as she raised an eyebrow. "What did you say?" she responded, tilting her head slightly. "You heard me. I want to see some identification," the officer repeated, his hand twitching near his belt where his baton rested, giving off an unspoken threat. A few bystanders took notice, glancing at the scene, but they quickly looked away, not wanting to get involved. Unbeknownst to the officer, he had just made a crucial mistake. Ella wasn't just an ordinary citizen, and she wasn't alone. Standing tall, she maintained her composure, neither nervous nor frightened. The tension in the air was palpable, but she was unmoved. Around them, the city continued as usual. Cars speeding by, voices from nearby conversations floating through the air, the occasional honk of a horn. But in the space between Ella and the officer, time seemed to stand still. "I said, show me your ID," the officer repeated, his voice more forceful now, as if he had already labeled her as trouble. Ella looked at him calmly. "What's the reason for this stop?" she asked, her tone measured and steady. The officer scoffed and stepped closer, blocking her way. "I don't have to explain myself. You match the description." There it was, the phrase that allowed vague suspicion to justify unwarranted action, the same phrase that turned mere assumptions into harassment. She took a slow breath, her fingers tightening slightly around the strap of her bag. "I match the description," she asked softly. "And what description would that be?" The officer's eyes flashed with irritation. He wasn't accustomed to being questioned. "Ma'am, don't make this harder than it needs to be," he warned, his hand now inching toward his baton. The weight of his authority hung in the air between them. More people had stopped to watch, some pulling out their phones to record from distance. Ella noticed, but her focus remained solely on the officer. "I'm not making this difficult," she replied firmly. "I'm asking a simple question." His patience snapped. "Turn around," he barked. Ella stood still for a moment, studying him with quiet resolve. Then she sighed, not out of fear, but with a hint of frustration. "You really don't know who I am, do you?" For the first time, the officer hesitated. His fingers tightened around his cuffs, but something about Ella's calm demeanor made him pause. A flicker of doubt crossed his mind, a crack in his earlier confidence. Before the officer could make his move, a stern voice cut through the air. "Step back from her." The officer froze, his hand still hovering near his belt. A group of sharply dressed individuals in dark suits approached, their movements purposeful and synchronized. Their eyes were fixed on the officer, their presence commanding. One of them had a gleaming badge on his chest, federal agents. In an instant, the officer's face went pale. He took a hesitant step back, his earlier bravado completely gone. The agents quickly surrounded Ella, forming a protective circle around her. She adjusted her blazer with a nonchalant air, brushing off the entire situation as if it were a mere inconvenience. One of the agents, taller and more imposing than the others, stepped forward. His voice was calm but authoritative. "You just laid hands on a protected individual," he stated, his gaze unflinching. The officer swallowed hard, his earlier confidence shattered. I didn't know," he stammered, still unsure whether to reach for his radio or stand with his hands visibly at his sides. The bystanders who had once been silent now murmured among themselves. Some raised their phones higher, capturing the unfolding scene. Ella's voice finally cut through the noise, smooth but tinged with quiet disappointment. "And yet," she said, "we didn't need to know who I was to treat me with respect." The words hung heavily in the air. The officer said nothing, his jaw clenched tightly. He knew he couldn't undo the damage. One of the agents exchanged a look with his colleagues before turning back to the officer. Internal affairs will be in touch, he said, the weight of the statement sinking in. The agents escorted Ella away, their presence commanding the scene. The crowd slowly began to disperse, but the moment lingered. The officer stood motionless, his heart racing as he realized the enormity of his mistake. His career, once secure, might never recover from this. In that moment, he understood what many had known for a long time. Unchecked power always comes with consequences. As Ella walked away from the scene, her steps were deliberate, unhurried, as though nothing had happened at all. The agents flanked her on either side, moving with a quiet assurance that spoke volumes about their training and the world they inhabited. Ella was no longer just a passerby in a busy city street. She was someone who had just experienced firsthand the fragile line between power and accountability. The officer, on the other hand, stood frozen, his mind racing. The weight of what had just unfolded was sinking in, but he couldn't quite process it. The world around him seemed to blur as he replayed every second of the encounter. The moment he had stepped in her path, he had made an assumption that turned into overreach, and overreach that had quickly spiraled into an unspoken lesson about respect and consequences. His stomach churned with the realization that, in his pursuit of authority, he had failed to see the bigger picture, the truth about who Ella really was and the network of protection that quietly encircled her. In the aftermath, the crowd that had once gathered in curiosity now dispersed, their phones tucked away, their murmurs fading into the background. The officers remained, but they were no longer the center of attention. The stage had shifted, and the unspoken message was clear. Those who abuse power will always be called to account, even if it takes time for the repercussions to unfold. The silent onlookers were left with something more than just a momentary spectacle. They had witnessed a reminder of the justice that can rise up, even in the most unexpected of circumstances. The officer, still standing by himself, could feel the weight of Ella's parting words lingering in the air. Asterisk, we didn't need to know who I was to treat me with respect. Asterisk, those words echoed in his ears, haunting him in a way that went beyond the physical discomfort of the situation. It wasn't just about the power he wielded, it was about how he used it. And in that instant, he understood the glaring truth. Authority should not come with arrogance or presumptions, but with responsibility and humility. Ella moved on, the incident behind her, but not forgotten. She stood tall, aware of her dignity and strength. The bystanders had seen the truth, even briefly, about respect and authority. As the agents escorted her away, her phone buzzed with messages. The news had spread, sparking a conversation about dignity and trust. Ella smiled, knowing moments like these could shift systems. The officer would answer for his actions, and Ella would continue her journey, unbroken and empowered. In the face of injustice, standing firm brings change.